Hello listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the energy news podcast from Montel, where we bring the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. This week we head to Sweden, where the country is increasingly at odds with Brussels. At the centre of the dispute is a huge pile of cash, or in technical jargon, congestion revenue. The billions of euros generated from price differences across Sweden's own grid and its interconnectors with neighbouring countries. Stockholm says that money should stay in Sweden to fix domestic bottlenecks and support consumers, while the EU wants greater flexibility to use some of those funds for wider European grid projects. The row is quickly becoming about far more than power markets, raising bigger questions around sovereignty, energy security, and Europe's push for deeper market integration. To set the scene, Montel's Sweden correspondent Wilhelm Zachrisson joins us to explain how congestion revenues became such a political flashpoint, and why frustrations over EU market rules and Germany's energy policy are now feeding into the debate. Now, Wilhelm, before we get into the wider political implications, can you explain exactly what has triggered this spat between the Swedish government and the EU, and why congestion revenues and interconnectors have suddenly become such a major issue?
I'll try to make it short, but domestically, congestion revenue has been an issue that's been going on since early this decade. Wind power in the north being built out, the prices go very low, we started seeing a big disconnect between the north and the south. Then the energy crisis came, high gas prices, and there was more connection in the southern Sweden to German prices and Danish prices, which made this gap between the south and the north very large. So then the congestion revenue started coming in. And the question was then, the TSO's view was, okay, we can use this. We can just invest it, build out the grid. But the congestion income came in so fast that they couldn't really get rid of it.
So it's a case of too much revenue coming from the congestion issues.
Yes, way too much. At the end of 2022, we had around, almost 6 billion euros. That has now grown to close to 8 billion euros. And while the TSO still have the view, eventually we will spend this. Since it just started stacking up, the trust in that eroded, and both politicians and market participants lost confidence in that. And now they want to look at other ways to spend it. But the EU regulation is quite firm on how you can spend it. And that's what the TSO is currently using it for, but can't really get it to use all this money that's stacking up.
So congestion revenues, how does the TSO get this cash from, if you like? How does that actually happen?
Well, simply, it is the difference between two price areas. So say I'm price area, we can call price area A, and your price area B. You're a consumer, I'm a producer. So I produce and sell that, and you want to buy that. But in reality, I only get paid the spot price in my price area. Say that's 20 euros. So I get paid the spot price for what I produce. But you buy my electricity that I produce. You're in price area B, then you pay that spot price, which is 30 euros. These 10 euros in the middle, that goes to the TSO.
Okay.
But it's not, it is considered a debt, a loan. So it's not something like we call, in Sweden, we usually say income, but it's not an income for the TSO. It's a debt they have to all market participants, which they then can use. And the thought is that they use this money coming in to build out the grid and get rid of this bottleneck, which is causing the two price areas to have different prices in the first place.
So if we can go on to the political implications and the current spat, Wilhelm. So Sweden's energy minister, Ebba Busch, has said that the country still supports interconnected markets, but doesn't want to be taken for granted by Brussels. So how significant are these comments that she's making? And is this kind of a big debate about energy nationalism versus integration with European markets?
I think, well, first off, I think Sweden has a long-standing grievance with Europe's largest market, Germany, and how they handle their energy policy. The largest grievance is that Germany won't separate into price areas. That's unfair because Sweden did it. From the European proposal for it got presented in December. We sit currently Sweden with this large issue of large congestion revenue just sitting, gathering dust on an account. But the EU in the grid package just proposed to take some of that and didn't propose any solution whatsoever on how we can get rid of our large problem. So Sweden felt ignored, and that felt very unfair for the government, market participants. Everyone got quickly very angry about this. So there's like now a wide consensus in the fight that is being held. Although with time, that fight has become a little bit muddy, and we got they've got some concessions from the EU. So like the fight now has become maybe a little bit more muddy, maybe not as easily sympathetic to Sweden's cause.
So it's a way of saying Sweden was forced to divide into price zones, and because of that move, then the congestion income revenues for the TSA have increased manifestly, and the EU is taking some of that away to boost maybe connection with a market that resolutely refuses to divide into price zones.
Yes. And now the concession from the EU is that they're not taking any internal revenue, internal congestion revenue. The EU has said, no, okay, we're not taking a part of that. We're only taking now 25% of the external revenue, which is so every another country, basically. They want to take 25% of that, and that was the concession made, which Sweden was happy with. Now, though, what they're fighting for now is the other part which they were upset about, which is that we still have a lot of money in an account that we can't use.
That's not just gathering dust, but it's gathering interest, I hope.
That is what the fight is about now, which still has a large consensus politically and with market participants. Of course, if you come to the question, how should we use it, then maybe the consensus isn't there anymore, but the consensus that we have to have some way to use this money and viable to have just sitting in an account.
Willem, thank you very much for setting the scene for us today.
Thank you.
Now we've covered why this political spat is happening between Sweden and the EU, I'm joined by Arne Bergvik, energy strategy consultant at Stockholm, to dive into the bigger questions around energy nationalism, interconnection, and Europe's electricity market future. Welcome to Plugged In, Arne.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So we're talking about a bit of a spat, a bit of a dispute between the EU or European Commission and Sweden. What's at the core of the issue here, or the disagreement, Arne?
Yeah, so the immediate issue here is the proposed reforms of the European electricity grid, referred to as the European grids package. And the argument from the Swedish government is that the EU proposal might then reduce Sweden's national control over its electricity grid and force Sweden to spend a quite big pile of congestion revenues according to EU priorities instead of Swedish priorities. So it's very much framed as a sovereignty issue here.
Both internal and external with Swedish neighbours.
Yes, indeed. So because of the big differences in price area, electricity prices within Sweden and with Sweden to surrounding countries, there is a quite significant amount of cash, more of a proposition how the EU can align to spend congestion fees in the whole of the EU in order to improve and reduce price area differences. And this is very much then the perspective of the Swedish government that is unfair, because in Sweden a very big portion of the congestion fees that other countries would like then to use according to proposition. And the response of the Swedish energy minister has been quite guarding that this is not okay from the perspective of Swedish consumers, and also that the Swedish government would not like to see this development. And as a leverage in this discussion, then the update of this was being put on hold as a leverage in these discussions with the EU.
So in a sense, they're downing tools, right? They're saying until we figure this out, or you give us some leeway, we're not going to continue work on this key interconnector between Sweden and Denmark. In the past, has Sweden taken such a strong stand against the EU or against the Commission?
Not in this typical set. I think this is rather new, and it must be seen also in a context of more populism and nationalistic kind of tendencies that we have been observing lately in many countries. So, as for example, Sweden or European right wing or Trump and MAGA, for example, the pendulum seems to be swinging back again. And I think the most important indicator of this is the Hungarian election on the 12th of April. Viktor Orban lost by 2/3 to challenger Peter Magyar. And that tells me two things: that populism is not necessarily that popular, and that it is rather difficult to be a nationalist in an international environment. And as we go closer to the EU timeframe here, it's a very short-sighted snapshot. We have an excess in Sweden of electricity that is being distributed out of Sweden, and that could increase prices in Sweden. But that is a surplus of electricity that we would not have if we would not have interconnections. And also the interconnections interaction is not that straightforward. It's a permanent flow back and forth between different countries, and in the global whole of things, this is improving welfare distribution, and it is also improving resilience, and it is a much more cost efficient system than would every country try to optimize their own grid in a standalone commissioning.
Absolutely, and the context you mentioned, the MAGA movement, you mentioned Viktor Orban, but we've also seen it in Sweden, neighbour to the west, which also has a big discussion around interconnectors and cables. We've seen certainly in Germany with the AfD and their responses to both interconnectors and to wind turbines. But the pendulum is swinging against this kind of level of populism, but what's happening on the energy side? Is there a return of energy nationalism, or do you think this is going to be fairly short-lived?
I would say that it is more in the light of the election coming up in Sweden on the 13th of September. You might know ruling bloc sits at 43.2% of the support at the moment, with opposition at 53.9%. So there is a tendency or a need to show that we are on the side of consumers here, that we are putting Sweden first, or doing some type of intervention and then showing us being very strong. I think that could be playing into it. And also, we have now a history of a few years of very low prices that has been shielding the Nordics, but northern Sweden in particular, but all of Sweden in general, from the higher prices in Europe, especially 2022, when the prices were really high due to the crisis in Russia. So I think that there have become kind of a common understanding that this is the normal situation, so to say, that we deserve low prices in the Nordics or in Sweden, and the interaction or integration with the European Union would actually not benefit us as much as we have something low prices and a lot of electricity that other countries would like to take away from us. But this is very much a snapshot view again, and it's very focused on the consumer side. And I would say, Richard, that consumption and a generation is quite strongly linked. And we would not be able to have as much generation if we would not have the interconnections because if you would shrink the markets by reducing the amount of interconnection, then you would have a much more inefficient grid, and much more expensive grid, and also you would have much less generation, because producers would not establish in a small market where they risk having locked in volumes and prices. But I think that that really what is different to a normal procedure, a normal discussion, is really how this has blown up a bit out of proportion in the view, in the light of that this is threatening then low electricity prices, and that money would be stolen away from Sweden and invested in other countries' grid infrastructure.
I mean, is there support for this position that, Sweden, the Swedish government is standing up for Swedish consumers and preventing the leakage of all this cash, as you put it, to its neighbours? Is there a broad support for that?
I think there is a broad support for Swedish congestion fees, foremost being used in Sweden in order to kind of work with a quite significant price area differences in Sweden. But I do not see that the kind of anti-European Union agenda would go very far. And I think that there is a consensus in Sweden, both from the ruling bloc and the opposition, that working with EU, solving these issues and working on a proposition that suits everyone is the way to go. So I think that this type of anti-transmission cables to other countries, that is more of a show maybe than a real policy in the making.
But as you say, political saber rattling. So why do you think, governments are increasingly tempted to prioritize domestic pricing over regional cooperation and perhaps, as you say, the sort of welfare benefits here,
So I think it is a kind of it could be due to the recent gains made politically by right-wing or nationalist or populist tendencies in the European Union, but also that was one of Viktor Orban's main topics, and that has also been used in politicians, but also been heavily criticized. So I think the end of the road here, and what the election in Hungary really shows us, is that in an international environment, combining the nationalism with pro-EU views is very difficult, and this is a very weak point of this type of rhetoric. And also that petrol prices will not guarantee a win in the election. And I think that is a very important kind of tell from the recent political development in the EU.
Absolutely, that's very, very interesting indeed, Arne. I mean, I think is a root of the problem here maybe that transmission capacity is maybe there isn't enough of that available to meet all this renewable generation, and so grid infrastructure is becoming a very important part of the debate.
Indeed, and I think that the reason why I tend to be rather certain on the point that this is more of a saber rattling that you said is because there is really no discussion. The transmission capacity, a very efficient way of sharing intermittent energy with surrounding countries, and one very important tool in the toolbox on how we can increase security of supply, include more renewable energy, push costs down of electricity, and part of the system solution that will avoid a lot of sub-optimizing in every corner of the EU. So I think if Europe wants to be strong and be able to compete against China and United States, then we really need to be more efficient. And efficient interconnections between countries is very much important then, because electricity, as the EA wrote in the International Energy Agency wrote in the 2024 World Energy Outlook, that we are entering at speed the age of electricity. And this can clearly be seen in in statistics that the electricity is really the way forward, not only because of digitalization and data centers, but also because of security of supply. And according to my analysis, Richard, when security of supply is at play, then we will have the really big changes in our energy system. And then we need more transmission capacity because welfare distribution, but also when it comes to integrating more renewables.
I mean, like you say, I think energy islands or, energy protectionism is really very, very detrimental in this. So, we should be looking for not just, an efficiency, but also, a European stand as one and being part of that copper plate, Arne. I'm sure that's what you're saying, because interconnection goes both ways, right? So if there's a scarcity of hydropower in Norway, I'm sure Sweden will come to the rescue, or others, maybe the wind in the UK. So it goes both ways, right?
Yes, definitely, and it goes both ways. It can alternate between a day or a year, and at the moment we have a quite unique situation where Sweden is almost exporting or net exporting at all hours of the year, but this will pass quite quickly, because at the moment we barely have any new commissioning of generation. In Sweden, but also in the Nordics. It's a very bleak picture compared with just a few years ago. So, for example, turbine orders in Sweden is down by 99% in 2025 compared with the peak in 2019. So we really have a contraction of supply, because we have an excess of supply currently, and the prices are really low. But that means also, as there's no better cure to a low price than a low price. Nothing encourage consumption as much. I would say that if you just would add a few, or like in a conservative way, just add a few of the electrification plans and data center plans in the Nordics, you will see that we will have a consumption that is about to surge. Of course, not everything will be realized, but in the other hand, if you ask yourself another hypothesis, you cannot say that nothing will be realized. So that means that this situation where the Nordic power prices are very much lower than European peers, which was never the case between, for example, 2007 to 2019, then we were very much connected. We had a much higher degree of market coupling. Well, that time is coming to an end, if this is true. And it's coming to an end really fast. We're looking into maybe a few years from now, we will see if you would use this fundamental approach, you would expect to see much more price coupling with the Nordics and the European peers. And you would also see interconnection capacity being enough to support other markets, but also when the Nordic market import, this is a very useful thing to have.
Absolutely, that's for sure. And I think it's very clear that, as you mentioned there, the oversupply is going to be dwindling as we see new demand centers, for example, data centers, etc., coming online in the Nordics. If I can just ask you a final question on it. So how do you see this spat playing out between the Swedish government and the European Commission?
I think everyone will be winners officially.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everyone will go away as a winner. And I think there will be, of course, as always, there will be a discussion that will lead to some type of final proposition or that everyone could live with. So it will not be. Already now we know it will not be as dramatic as was firstly proposed or was proposed initially by the European Union, and it will not be as bad as sounded sounded by the government when they sounded alarm. So I think that it will be somewhere in between, a deal that everyone will be able to live with, and I think the official view will be that we show them and that we reached our goals both in the EU and in Sweden.
And maybe they can return to upgrading the Conti scan line.
Yes, indeed, and maybe also the Hansa Power Bridge interconnection with Germany that was cancelled a few years ago, and efficient electricity markets translated into cheaper electricity.
So yeah,
that's how we look at it.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much, Arne, for being a guest on this week's Plugged In podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That's Arne Bergvik arguing that despite the political rhetoric, Sweden's energy future still depends on stronger European integration and interconnection. But politically, Sweden's stance toward Brussels is clearly hardening. So what's driving that shift? I'm now joined by Sebastian de Toro, partner and head of investor services at New Republic, to explain. Welcome to Plugged In, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, we're talking about this spat between Sweden and the EU. I mean, Sweden has traditionally been a very strong supporter of European market integration. What's changed?
I mean, first, to be honest, I think we should not oversimplify Sweden's position historically. So when it comes to our view on the European Union and integration, I mean, we entered the European Union in 1995 after a referendum where they just won with a slight majority. We voted against the euro. And we've also been quite skeptical of large EU budgets. So I think if you look at it in general perspective, we are members. We think that integration is good in many ways, but we're not being 100% pro all of the time. I think that our view is quite pragmatic, not so ideological. So, I mean, if things work well, we're in favor of them. And if they're not working well, of course, the public sentiment changes. And when it comes to integration, I think that most people perceive that integration has worked well for them. And so that's why we perhaps have been positive in that way. But if you're looking at the situation right now, especially when it comes to energy policy, there is both internal debate in Sweden on energy policy, where it's quite divided between left and right. And that comes down to, it boils down much to the energy sources. So it's nuclear versus renewables. But then the entire area gets a little bit hijacked by this debate. And when we also see increases in prices, as we have seen after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's happening now in the Strait of Hormuz and other things happening, of course, people are watching this area and thinking, are we doing things right or wrong? And the debate also regarding the congestion fees and the transmission grid has highlighted that we are paying a lot of money and people are feeling that the European Union perhaps wants to grab that money that is supposedly Swedish money. And that makes people a little bit more reluctant to what's going on in the European Union. And it's easy for politicians in Sweden to exploit that feeling among the electorate and create some heat. But I think when you look at it, I don't think that Swedish politicians in general are against European integration, that there are some parts of the integration that they are skeptical about.
Why is it taking this tough stance now, Sebastian, on this issue in particular?
No, but I think what's happened is actually that prices have gone up. The cost of living is a very vivid debate in Sweden. People are feeling that they're paying too much for energy and other things as well, food prices, for example. And it's easier for the Swedish politicians to exploit that feeling. So I think that's a sense of urgency is that something has happened right now, and that the debate from other energy topics is also transferred to this. I mean, to the situation with the grid and the congestion fees. And there is also, I think, if you also want to broaden it, and that's not something that's happened exactly right now, but has been mounting over a couple of years, is that Sweden was a country that actually did introduce the different bidding areas, according to the regulation that the European Union supposedly should have implemented all over Europe. But we are one of the few countries that have done so, and Germany hasn't. And of course, there has been a growing sentiment about this. Is this right? Is it fair? Should we do this? Because there is at least a political dimension that is costly here. Perhaps it might be good for the economy to have those different bidding areas. It might be good for Sweden as an economy, even though Germany hasn't implemented it. But from a political perspective in Sweden, it's difficult because, of course, the people in south of Sweden are really fed up and a lot of people are living there. So that's a big electorate. And Swedish politicians had to deal with that. So if you combine this growing irritation about the situation between Sweden and the European Union and what has happened over the last 2-3 years with prices growing and people being angry around these issues, I think that's the reason why it has been accelerated. And then I think also this quite offensive or broad, you can say, a more vivid statement from Ebba Busch is also part of her personality. She's a quite outspoken politician, so perhaps other politicians would have phrased it differently.
So to frame it in terms of sort of energy nationalism or protectionism, even isolationism, would be too simplistic, do you think, Sebastian?
I think that's too simplistic, yes. I mean, I think that Swedes in general are favor of the European Union and European integration. But of course, we want the different parts to work well. And here, when it comes to the question of us having different bidding zones, Germany don't have it. We have the congestion fees that has been discussed that they should be used in other countries instead of Sweden. Those particularities are irritating people.
Yeah.
But not integration and in general, I would say.
But what are the implications for a kind of common energy policy, a connected Europe, if sort of national governments, protect their own national interests in similar ways? Does that undermine the European common market for energy, for example?
I mean, if all countries would end up in a situation where you only think about your own country, that would, of course, be problematic, because in the best of worlds, I would say that an integrated market, both when it comes to energy and other markets as well, is beneficial for the European Union as a whole and for most of its members. So, I mean, if you start to take the energy market, of course, if there is a possibility for energy producers to locate themselves where there is big demand, or big energy consumers to locate themselves where there is large production capacity, or if that's not possible, if there is a good opportunity of trading, of course, at the big picture, that's beneficial for all. If the rules are similar, if taxes and other rules are fair between the countries. But from a Swedish perspective, of course, people are saying that they aren't fair. So in that sense, there might be political logic in opposing to be 100% compliant with this kind of overarching goal. Then, of course, there is another dimension, and that is the new world, whereas geopolitical security has to be taken into account, and that perhaps could change this equation a bit, making it much more logical also for countries to think a little bit of their own. Because if there is a mounting crisis, perhaps you have to think about how do you secure energy production within your own country.
I mean, how do you see this playing out now, Sebastian? Because obviously, from a Swedish perspective, it's the Swedes feel unjustly treated here, and a preferential treatment given to Germany, for example, as you've laid out. But from the European side, it's like, well, these are the rules, and you have to abide by the rules, the common electricity rules. So how are we at a kind of immovable point here?
Well, I don't know if the final word has still been said about which interpretation of the rules that is the right one. I mean, from the Swedish perspective, of course, it's not seen as fair that we have the different bidding zones and Germany don't, because supposedly they should have bidding zones also. And if that system makes that we have more congestion fees mounting up than other countries, and that we have to pay those the money that we have amounted from Swedish electricity consumers to other parts in Europe in order to deal with the lack of transmission capacity, I would say that Swedes wouldn't agree on that. And I think that the position that Ebba Busch has taken in this field is defended by all politicians in Sweden. I don't think that no politician would survive following, another position that she has taken in this matter.
Sebastian, thank you very much for your insights into this very delicate matter, and thank you for being a guest on the Plugged In podcast.
Okay, thank you very much.
And to you listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Plugged In. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, rate, and follow to make sure you get the latest podcast episodes as soon as we release them every Thursday. We'd also love to read your reviews of the podcast. It helps us to keep up to date with what you, our listeners, think of the podcast and what content you want to receive more of. Finally, you can head to montelnews.com for more news and analysis from our team of journalists across Europe and beyond. See you next time.